The first transcontinental railroad in North America was completed over 150 years ago. Since that time, railroads have continued to expand across the continent. Some companies have combined to form super railroads. These types of railroad mergers happened from time to time throughout most of the 20th century. After a more than 20-year hiatus, one final major North American railway merger occurred, a merger said to be the largest ever. On April 14, 2023, Canadian Pacific Railway and Kansas City Southern joined forces to become CPKC Rail. For the first time in history, a single rail carrier connected Mexico, Canada, and the United States. To celebrate the completion of what may very well be the last great railway merger, CPKC announced that they would run a special steam train excursion from Calgary, Alberta in Canada to Ciudad de Mexico or Mexico City, Mexico. The locomotive selected to pull the train was none other than Canadian Pacific number 2816. This high-speed passenger and freight locomotive was built in December of 1930 and pulled trains in Canada for 30 years before initial retirement in 1960. Knowing this would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see this historic train, I turned to the east to see the 2816 as it pulled the CPKC Final Spike Tour. The Final Spike Tour was a 4,800-mile-long journey that took over a month to complete. Departing Calgary on April 26th, it traveled on former Canadian Pacific rails across Alberta and Saskatchewan and then through the upper Midwest of the United States as far as Kansas City. From there, the special continued onto the former Kansas City Southern system through the southern U.S., along the Gulf Coast, and then into Mexico. After just shy of a week of traveling across the eastern half of Mexico, it arrived in Mexico City on June 4, 2024. The train was greeted by hundreds of thousands of people along the way across the 3 countries it visited. I made the decision to follow the train over just a portion of its tour as it entered the United States and crossed North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Between the U.S.-Canada border and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I followed the train for nearly 1,000 miles over the course of a week. Our journey begins on the afternoon of April 29, 2024, in the far northern reaches of North Dakota. This is the town of Portal, a quiet community that is home to a little over 100 residents. Portal is a railroad town and has been pretty much since the beginning. It is also a border town and marks the point on the railroad where Canadian and American operating crews trade off as trains cross between the 2 respective countries. For most of its existence, the rail line between Portal and Minnesota's Twin Cities was operated under the name Soo Line as a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Earlier on the morning of April 29, 2816 departed Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan for a 270-mile-long all-day journey to Minot, North Dakota. The train was expected to reach the U.S.-Canada border in the early afternoon and then continue the final 90 miles to Minot after a couple-hour-long stop for inspections, servicing, and a crew change. With some time to spare, I continued a few miles south and east from Portal to pick out my first spot to see the train. I settled on a location along Highway 52 in the town of Flaxton. With frogs croaking loudly in the ponds below, one got a sense that spring had finally arrived in the Midwest. The train ended up arriving Portal around 2 p.m. Central Time and finally departed for Minot at 5:15. With a fully matching set of 14 railway business cars painted up in the Canadian Pacific's maroon scheme, 2 vintage diesels, and 2816 leading the way, the train was an impressive sight. Much of the Midwest is dotted with various grain silos, such as this one in the town of Bow Bells. A former Grand Trunk Western Railroad GP9 moved hopper cars under the loader at the silo for eventual shipment. The transport of grain provides a considerable amount of business for railroads in the Midwest, and CPKC is no exception. South of Kenmare, North Dakota, the final spike tour approached an undercrossing of Highway 52 in the Della River Valley. The train had to pause briefly on the north side of Kenmare to allow high-priority CPKC train number 149 to pass through. Even in rural North Dakota, dozens of fans followed along as the train rolled on in the late afternoon sunlight. At 5 minutes till 8, the special rounded a big curve on final approach into Minot. As sunset came, the train was brought to the southeast side of the city and positioned on one of the tracks in the small CPKC Minot yard. The next day was one of just 10 planned public display events on the journey south to Mexico City. On April 30th, 2816 began the day simmering away in the Minot yard as crews prepared the locomotive for public display in downtown that afternoon. The 2816 was built in December of 1930 by the Montreal Locomotive Works, the Canadian subsidiary of Alco. It was given the official designation of H1B. The H in this designation indicates the locomotive's Hudson-type wheel arrangement with 4 pilot wheels, 6 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. As of 2024, it is the only operational Hudson-type locomotive in North America. The 2816 was part of Canadian Pacific's second order of 10 non-streamlined Hudson locomotives. It was used mainly in passenger service in eastern Canada. One of the locomotive's final assignments was pulling commuter trains out of Montreal, Quebec. With more than 2 million miles of revenue service in the books, the 2816 was finally retired in May of 1960 after nearly 3 decades of continuous operation. The locomotive was saved for preservation by Francis Nelson Blount, becoming the only non-streamlined Canadian Pacific Hudson to avoid the scrapper's torch. It joined his Steamtown collection and was eventually transferred into the care of the U.S. National Parks Service. Canadian Pacific acquired the locomotive in 1998 to become a rolling ambassador for the railroad. 2816 made its triumphant return to steam in late 2001. It was given the nickname Empress as a nod to the railroad's past fleet of transatlantic ocean liners. After a decade of special excursions all over the Canadian Pacific system, 2816 was placed into storage at CP headquarters in Calgary. It was reactivated specifically to lead the final spike special following the completion of the CPKC merger. During its most recent restoration in 2022 and 2023, 2816 received additional modernization upgrades including improved lubrication systems and a full standalone positive train control system, the first of its kind on a steam locomotive. I went southeast of town to look at a few locations for the journey across North Dakota the next day. As I was searching, train 149, the highest priority train on the railroad, came barreling west toward Minot. The public exhibition of the 2816 was set for downtown Minot on the main line from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Since there was no passing track at the display location, CPKC shut the railroad down for 3 hours through Minot while the exhibition was open to the public. 149 was the last train to pass through before the event. Around 4 p.m., the train was backed out of the yard to reach the display site. Of the 14 business cars on the train, 11 were lettered for the Canadian Pacific and the remaining 3 for Kansas City Southern. One of the most noteworthy cars was the Canadian Pacific Dome car Selkirk. Previously owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad and numbered 3605, it was custom built out of a tavern car in the mid-1950s and saw regular use on the Shasta Daylight. The Dome car was not the only piece of equipment on the train that was once owned by the Southern Pacific. The first of two extra water tenders behind the 2816 came from cab forward locomotive 4219 and has been used regularly since the 1980s on excursion trips pulled by Southern Pacific Daylight locomotive 4449. Canadian Pacific leased the tender out for additional water capacity on the final spike tour. "2816 came to a stop right in front of the old 1912-built Sioux Line depot. A large number of Minot's 48,000 residents turned out to see the train despite the afternoon storm. In addition to the locomotive and train, there were several other booths and displays present, including the CPKC Connecting a Continent exhibit. This special semi-trailer was outfitted with timelines illustrating the history of Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, as well as various other historical artifacts from both railroads. A few minutes after 7, with 2 blasts of the whistle, 2816 departed the display site and returned to the yard. You may notice at this point that the 2816 has 2 different whistles. The main whistle used on the trip, located near the smokestack, is a 5-chime off of Canadian Pacific locomotive 5935. Heard less often is a 6-chime whistle located on the left side of the locomotive directly ahead of the cab. This is a replica of the 2816's original whistle and was installed during the initial restoration of the locomotive in 2001. The 5-chime was added a few years later and functions off of an air valve rather than a more traditional hand-operated whistle cord. This setup is easier for the crew to use and is also not as loud in the cab of the locomotive. I got up early on the morning of May 1st and set up my cameras at the 37th Avenue Railroad crossing on the south side of Minot. It was a cold morning with temperatures in the mid-30s, perfect weather for producing those big fluffy steam clouds. This would be one of the longest days for the 2816, a 350-mile marathon run cutting diagonally right across the state of North Dakota from Minot to Glenwood, Minnesota. A few minutes before 7 a.m., the final spike special departed Minot. As it approached the 37th Avenue crossing a few minutes down the line, steam came billowing out of the 2816 in the cold morning air. You might have recognized the absence of the auxiliary lights, or ditch lights, from the front of the 2816. These lights are required even on steam locomotives operating on all major rail lines in Canada, but are not mandated for steam and older diesels in the US. During the previous night, the CPKC steam crew removed them from the locomotive for the rest of the journey across the US and Mexico. "2816 wasn't on the move long before it came to a stop once again near the town of Logan to wait for westbound CPKC train number 445. With 445 in the clear, 2816 came flying through as the train approached Velva. The first servicing stop of the day was at Harvey, North Dakota. By 9:45, the train was back on the road. Workers at the Arthur Company's grain elevator on the east side of town came out to greet the train as it passed through. "2816 rolled on through Carrington as a layer of clouds moved in. Highway 52 closely paralleled the railroad for nearly 90 miles out of Minot. The road left the tracks for the last time in Carrington, as both continued their trek across the grassy drift prairie of North Dakota. My next stop to see the 2816 was in Valley City. After making another stop for servicing and to allow other train traffic to clear, the special was once again on the move, climbing the grade through town and passing under U.S. Interstate 94 in the midday sun. Around 2 in the afternoon, the train rolled into Enderlin, North Dakota. Here, it would make another stop to change crews. Enderlin is a small town with a population of less than 1,000. It is said that the name refers to the fact that this site was once the end of the line for the railroad. At 3 p.m., the train was once again flying along as it headed for Minnesota. As the sun once again gave way to clouds, the special approached Fairmount, North Dakota. The train made another stop for servicing at Fairmount. This would be the last stop for servicing before the train's ultimate destination for the day of Glenwood. Just 1.5 miles to the east of town, the special would enter the state of Minnesota. I saw the train one more time for the day as it climbed a grade through Elbow Lake. May 2nd was a much shorter journey for the train, about 120 miles in all. On this day, the train traveled through stormy weather across Minnesota from Glenwood to CPKC's Humboldt Yard in Minneapolis. The train had another early departure, around 7 a.m., and then traveled through heavy rain to reach the Twin Cities. The squalls subsided just a little bit as the train passed through the city of Plymouth. By mid-morning, the train had arrived at Humboldt Yard in Minneapolis. Even here, groups of railroad enthusiasts came to see the train from a distance as the CPKC steam crew inspected the locomotive and train and prepared for the public display in St. Paul the next day. The next morning brought sunny skies once more. 2816 had a short trip on this day, a 20-mile move across the Twin Cities from Humboldt Yard to St. Paul Union Depot, where the next official public display was scheduled. This exhibit was open from 3 to 8 p.m. Around 12:40, the train began to move out of Humboldt Yard. The run through Minneapolis and St. Paul would be relatively slow, so plenty of time was given to allow the train to reach the display site. Following the conclusion of the event at Union Station, the train proceeded ahead to St. Paul Yard. The steam crew was given Saturday, May 4th off before the big 2-day run down the Mississippi River and across Wisconsin to Chicago. On Sunday, May 5th, the final Spike Special made a 230-mile-long run from St. Paul, Minnesota to Portage, Wisconsin, over rails that once belonged to the famed Milwaukee Road. This was perhaps the most scenic day of the trip, with miles of running right along the Mississippi River. The day began cloud-free with temperatures in the 50s. I started my chase of the train in Red Wing, Minnesota, gazing out over the river and the town from the Highway 63 bridge. The CPKC dispatcher held the special in St. Paul to allow Amtrak's eastbound Empire Builder, Train 8, to pass through. As soon as Amtrak cleared, 2816 departed St. Paul just after 9 a.m. The builder pulled out of Red Wing right on time at 9:44. Two of Amtrak's new ALC 42 Charger locomotives pulled the train as it quickly accelerated out of town. "20 minutes later, 2816 came powering by, its whistle echoing off the buildings of the adjacent Red Wing grain facility. After a servicing stop in Wabasha, 2816 continued south along the banks of the Mississippi River and U.S. Highway 61. At River Junction, the rail line splits, with one route continuing south along the Mississippi to Davenport, Iowa, and the other turning east across the river for Milwaukee and Chicago. The final Spike Special took the route toward Chicago, crossing over the river and into Wisconsin. It paused for servicing at La Crosse before continuing toward Portage. It was 3:15 in the afternoon when 2816 roared through the Wisconsin Dells and by the circa 1989 Amtrak depot. Less than 20 miles down the line, the train reached its destination for the day at Portage, Wisconsin. Monday, May 6, 2024 was the final day I followed the 2816 on its journey to Mexico City. On this day, the train traveled from Portage, Wisconsin to Chicago, Illinois. The next public display event was set to take place in the neighboring village of Franklin Park on May 8th. A few minutes after 9 a.m., the final Spike Special departed Portage for the approximately 180-mile-long journey into the Windy City. Along the shores of Lake Milwaukee, a crowd of over 100 rail enthusiasts and casual observers gathered to watch the 2816 as it rolled through town. After the first service stop of the day had been completed just a few miles to the west, the train came flying through, whistle blaring all the way. I got ahead of the train as it slowed for downtown Milwaukee. My final view of the special was on the south side of Milwaukee as it rounded the curve at the Waterford Avenue crossing. The 2816 continued on to Chicago that afternoon, but the journey was far from over. Following the event in Franklin Park, The train made additional display stops in Davenport, Iowa, Kansas City, Missouri, Shreveport, Louisiana, and Laredo, Texas in the U.S. 2816 crossed into Mexico on May 30th, becoming the first steam locomotive to operate in Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. After a long 4,800-mile trip, the train finally arrived into the suburbs of Mexico City on the evening of June 4, 2024. The Final Spike Steam Tour was a once-in-a-lifetime event. CPKC's steam team worked tirelessly to bring 2816 on one of the most unique transcontinental voyages that has ever been undertaken. It will not soon be forgotten by the large crowds that gathered all along the line to watch it pass by. Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern are now united as one railroad, the first to connect Canada, the US, and Mexico as a single carrier. With this newly forged partnership, CPKC Rail brings improved railway connectivity to North America. And as for 2816, the final spike may have been driven, but there are hopefully many more miles ahead for the Empress as the goodwill ambassador for Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern.